Today we're going to learn about depth of field and what is depth of field. Depth of field can range from a shallow depth of field right up to an extensive depth of field. And for an example in relation to shallow depth of field, we would use a shallow depth of field when we're photographing a portrait of somebody. So when you want to get somebody's nice features out and just, you know, have their face in focus and everything else out of focus, that's what a shallow depth of field is, when everything else is blurred in the background and the foreground is in focus. So when would we use an extensive depth of field? For example, when we're photographing a landscape, so you want everything in the foreground in focus and everything in the background in focus. Another good example of where you would use extensive depth of field is if you're photographing a group shot at a wedding. You don't want the person in the back to be out of focus. You want them to be as pin sharp as the person in the front. So an extensive depth of field would be a very good example of a group shot at a wedding. So why should you use depth of field in your photographs? Another example would be if you're photographing two GAA players on a football field and they're embracing because they've just scored a goal or a point or whatever. To put the focus on them is really good and it's very effective. So they're in focus, everything else is out of focus, so you can get a sense of the atmosphere in the background. The crowd are there, but you can't really see them. You could take it with an extensive depth of field. It wouldn't be as interesting. They'd nearly get lost in the crowd, you know, so you want to put the focus on what's happening on them and have everything else out of focus for a shallow depth of field. So most cameras have a depth of field setting on them. My own camera here has a depth of field setting on it and it's AV. So when I turn this to AV, I can decide what the aperture is going to be. So for example, if I want a shallow depth of field, I'll go down in the number. So my camera goes down here to 2.8. And effectively what that means, just in simple terms, it's almost like the iris in your eye. So the iris in your eye opens and closes and lets light in and lets light out, okay? So when the iris opens in your eye, it lets much more light in, so that would be 2.8. So this is where the focus is put on the subject and everything else is blurred out in the background. And when it closes down, it goes up the other end of the scale on the camera and it's f8. F8 allows you then photograph an extensive depth of field. Everything in the shot is going to be in focus. Down the other end of the scale at 2.8, you're going to get a much shallower depth of field. So today we met Tasha and baby Annabelle and I displayed what a shallow depth of field is and an extensive depth of field. And in my opinion, the shallow depth of field wins out all the way when it comes to portraits. And today, for example, we put the focus on Tasha and baby Annabelle, blurred out the background with their shallow depth of field, and it's just far more effective. You can really feel the love in the shot, whereas the shot with the extensive depth of field, everything is in focus and your eye is drawn all around the picture. You're looking at the background and you're looking at the sofa. You know, you just want to be looking really at their expression. So shallow depth of field in this instance worked far better. So bearing all of this in mind now, you'll be able to go out and take lots of lovely photographs using depth of field.